Hi, Sharon, and thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it because I know that you travel the world teaching meditation and you're extremely busy with that. So, just to get straight into it, the first question I wanted to ask is a more personal one, which is why do you meditate?
I've been meditating since I was 18 years old, which is quite a long time ago now.
Hmm.
So I've been practicing for over 40 years, and that is actually a difficult question for me to answer at this point because, of course, it's so central to my life and has been my entire adult life. But um, I think that in the beginning I meditated. I was drawn to meditation because I was in a lot of emotional pain and turmoil. I'd had a very kind of disrupted childhood, as many people do, and somehow intuitively, because this was quite a long time ago, I just had a sense that if I could meditate, if I could learn how to meditate, I would be happier. That, especially, I think if I was going to use one word to describe myself, I'd say fragmented. I felt like I didn't really know who I was, and I was all torn apart. And there was just this instinct that
Mm,
if I could learn meditation, I could weave those parts of myself together and feel whole. And of course, that's what happened.
mm, thank you. I wondered specifically about loving kindness meditation, if you could share something of your personal journey and exploration with that particular form of meditation and how your understanding and practice may have changed over time.
In 1985, I went to Burma and I had the opportunity to sit for 3 months doing just loving kindness practice. So that was really like an intensive immersion in it, and I loved it, and it was very important for me. I felt like it really changed me in really good ways, and I did for about 4 years. My practice was loving kindness practice. One of the things I really like about loving kindness practice is that, and it's also a big challenge too, even though I personally like it, is the fact that the changes you see really happen in your life. They may not happen in that formal period, say half an hour every morning when maybe you're meditating at home, even though what most of us would like is just that. We would like a great breakthrough experience and to be able to say, oh, like 4:15, I loved myself completely, or I forgave everybody, or something like that. It's usually not like that. But in conversations with others, or meeting a stranger, or being in some situation, maybe you have to speak publicly where normally you're really nervous, and everyone out in that crowd, you have the feeling like ordinarily, like, oh, they're there to judge me.
Hmm.
Suddenly, there's more of a feeling of like we're in this together, or maybe you do make a mistake, you say the wrong thing, or you're too timid to say anything, but you can let go of that with much more kindness toward yourself and just start over and keep on going. And so you see changes in your life much more than you are likely to see them in your formal practice.
Mm, that's really interesting. Yeah. Um, I'm wondering the loving kindness meditation when I personally came in contact with it, that was through the Buddhist teachings. I found sometimes the language could be a little bit, I don't know, formal or a little bit alienating in some way. Do you have any advice or suggestions for people that might struggle with that?
In all meditation practice that is, you could say, held in the Buddhist tradition, or uh, contained in the Buddhist tradition, is meant to be something that can be practiced completely aside from any belief system or particular faith orientation. I mean, that's their purpose. It's not to make people Buddhists,
Mm,
or instill a kind of dogma at all, but to it's almost a kind of mental training.
hmm.
And just like we might choose other kinds of training, okay, it's a mental training. I'm going to train my attention to be more stable and more inclusive and more open and all kinds of things. So,
Hmm.
so that's really what it's about. And for some people, like I too, of course, encountered it within the Buddhist tradition. And so, to some extent, I'm always mentally translating things
Mm-hmm.
into my real life experience. Like, what would this look like in this day and age, or
Mm-hmm.
for a Western person, or something like that. So for some people, that's an option. And there are also many ways of finding practice these days, of course, that are they're all relanguaged. They're
Mm-hmm.
not said in the same old-fashioned ways. And so some of my books are like that, but many, many approaches
Yeah.
are especially designed for that, because they're. It's one thing if you're making an offering and people who choose to come can come. It's another thing if you're going into, say, a medical setting,
Yeah.
or some where very specifically, it can't be uh, seen as a part of a belief system at all.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned your books, and you've written a number of books and recorded many CDs of meditation. And your latest book, correct me if I'm wrong, but is The Real Happiness. Yeah.
Yeah.
The Power of Meditation. Can you give your perspective on how meditation can support us in developing real happiness?
When we talk about happiness, it's not just the pursuit of pleasure as it might ordinarily be, in just kind of common
Mm-hmm.
usage, but it's something much, much deeper. And so uh, maybe the word real helps in that
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
sense. And so, of course, for me, meditation has been the core, it's been the very foundation of my experience of happiness, because it's been the means by which I've learned to not be so distracted, to be able to experience joy and pleasure without that extra thing we sometimes do of trying to grab on and keep everything from changing, and being so afraid it's going to change, and only to find that it does. And it's enabled me, it's really been like a training in looking at difficult physical states, emotional states, everything, without adding on so many of those things that actually make our experience much harder.
Mm.
And of course, it's been a means of sort of waking up during all those ordinary, undistinguished times that make up a lot of our day, and therefore a lot of our life. And so meditation is completely, for me, connected to this idea of real happiness.
Mm. You mentioned that it's helped you. It helps with not grabbing onto the pleasant and not kind of avoiding the suffering and the pain, being able to sort of move towards that, and then being in the ordinary as well, and waking up to the ordinary. Is there anything that comes to mind that you could share about sort of how to use mindfulness or meditation with the ordinary from your own perspective?
Well, first of all, I would say in our day, one of the things we have to think about is at least sometimes not multitasking, and trying to experience, like, if I'm feeling the warmth of this cup, to actually feel it for a moment. It doesn't have to be maybe your entire day, but we can punctuate the kind of crazy momentum and not being present. And then it's interesting because it's the kind of thing we dismiss. We think, oh, it's so stupid, it's so boring. I need something exciting.
Mm.
But if we can actually just stop a moment and feel, then it's got layers of nuance, and all kinds of things are going on there in that in that one moment, and what we think of as neutral or ordinary experiences just like that. So the story I tell in one of my books is about at some point when I was living in India in the 70s, I was practicing with a certain method of mindfulness meditation amongst the many, many possible methods. And this method was one where we were asked to quietly place a mental note or a label on our predominant experience. So if I was reaching for that cup, I might mentally be going reaching, and then touching, something like that. So I was in this compound in India, and I realized that the single most common mental note I was making was that of waiting. I was kind of going around saying, waiting, 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 waiting. One day I said to myself, well, what are you waiting for? And I realized I was waiting for something important enough to happen, or significant enough to happen, or spiritual enough to happen for me to actually put a label on it. And I also realized I was, in effect, living my life as though a tape recorder with the pause button on.
Mm.
And so that was a good eye opener. And I now much more remember, okay, just this. Don't look for something more exciting or stimulating or intense in order to feel alive. Just this. Just feel this.
Mm. And that's such a relevant point in the time that we're living in, with exponential development of technology and so many inputs and stimulation all the time, that it's almost like our neurology is just getting so used to constantly being stimulated.
Yeah.
Mm.
And we want more and more and more and more.
Yeah. I just wanted to go back to something you said about the add-ons, because I think that's a really interesting, important point, and a lot of people that are new to meditation might, be curious to hear a bit more about that. So you talked about experience, like whether it's pleasant or perhaps unpleasant, and the add-ons. Can you speak a bit more about what you mean about these add-ons?
Yeah, and that's almost one of the main points of meditation practice is how to relinquish those add-ons, which means, first of all, seeing them and understanding that's distinct from our actual experience. So sometimes I actually tell the story about I was teaching with my friend, my colleague, Joseph Goldstein, and Joseph and I were just sitting in the kitchen somewhere having a cup of tea, and somebody came into the kitchen and said to Joseph, I've had this really bad experience. So Joseph said, well, what happened? And he said, well, I was sitting and I felt all of this tension in my jaw. And I realized what an incredibly uptight person I am and how I always have been and I always will be. And Joseph said, you mean you felt a lot of tension in your jaw? And he said, yes, and I've never been able to get close to people and it's never going to change. And Joseph said, you mean you felt a lot of tension in your jaw? And they just sort of went back and forth. And it was very interesting for me watching them go back and forth and back and forth. And finally, Joseph said something to him like, why are you adding a miserable self-image to a painful experience? It's like painful enough to feel the tension in our jaw, and that's real. That's authentic. But on top of that, we have, this is never going to change. This is going to be my experience forever. This means this about me. Nothing else is true about me. And that's going to last forever. So we just kind of pile on a lot of reactions, interpretations, judgments, and we actually more or less lose touch with the original experience. So in mindfulness, we're not really talking about never having a reaction or never having an interpretation, but maybe we want to clear the decks a little bit from that kind of automatic, reflexive, habitual reaction to be with the actual experience a little bit more before we have some decision about it or what we're going to do about it.
From your perspective, how does this process of acceptance actually support transformation and change?
Well, I know the words can be very difficult because acceptance can sound so passive and complacent and without a kind of dynamic relationship to what's happening, but that's not really what it's meant to imply. The first thing that we would say is that we hardly know our experience usually because of all those add-ons that we're usually on. So we may not know the real texture and nature of that tension in our jaw because almost as soon as it begins, we're thinking about 10 years from now and how it's still going to be there and, what's that going to mean? And so the first thing we want to relinquish is the hold of those add-ons so that we can experience much more directly, okay, what is happening right now? What does this feel like? And then, we see that if we're struggling against it, we hate it, we find it, it shouldn't be there. We feel like we failed because it's there. There's not going to be a lot of learning going on. There's not going to be even space to be looking more carefully at the nature of the pain. And also, if we get lost in it, identified with it, kind of swamped, like this is all I will ever feel,
Mm-hmm.
There's not going to be a lot of learning going on. So we want to create a relationship to our experience where we can see more deeply into it, understand it on a lot of different levels, and then we realize we have a choice. How do I want to relate to this? Do I want to seek medical help for this, since we're
Mm-hmm.
on the tension in
Mm-hmm.
our part?
Yeah.
Uh, do I want to um, do these exercises? Do I want to, talk to somebody about it, or do I want to
Mm-hmm.
just sit and observe it? We do have a choice as to how
Mm-hmm.
we behave when we're not so caught and when we're deepening our understanding.
Mm-hmm.
A very good example would be something like a burst of anger, a wave of anger,
Mm-hmm.
because we have so many habitual reactions to that experience. Maybe we dislike it and we feel we failed, and we kind of go careening off into this whole spate of self-judgment, like, I've been meditating for over 40 years, why do I still have this is so bad, this is so wrong. Or maybe we get lost in it. I'm such an angry person and I always will be. This is who I am, and so we we don't necessarily have the kind of space to look more deeply at the anger. But what happens if we do? We see, oh, look at that, it's not just one thing. There are these strands of sadness and fear and maybe helplessness and all kinds of
Mm-hmm.
things. And not only that, they're always changing, they're moving, they're coming, they're going. There's actually some space within the anger itself. And so if we have that deeper experience, then we have the choice of how we want to respond to that troubling situation or that provocation. And maybe we don't want to, like, just have this anger overwhelm us, write out the email and press send. You know, in that space, we might say, okay, I'm going to write the email and not press send for a while.
Yeah.
Or I'm going to try to convey a lot of those emotional levels, not just the rage, but also the sadness, also the fear, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
We understand many options.
Oh, thank you for sharing that example. That's a really useful picture of what we're talking about. Do you see a relationship between meditation and creativity? And if so, could you speak a bit to that?
With meditation and creativity, I think it's a lot like what we've just been talking about, that once we have space, we're not caught in the grip of these automatic, immediate reactions to things, just born out of habit. Then there's space, and once we have space, creativity can arise. We might see the connections between things that don't, on the surface, really seem connected. I mean, I noticed that in writing, especially when I was writing this one book I wrote called Faith.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like the best writing I did was when mentally did, was when I first woke up in the morning, because it's like the sensor hadn't yet woken up, and so just these ways things were connected would just come to me. And when I was meditating, and I didn't sit down to meditate thinking, oh, I've got to work through chapter 5 or anything like that. I would just be doing my meditation practice. But because there was more mental space, these connections would arise in that process. So I felt like it was really, it's like creating the conditions for. Sorry.
Whoops.
That was just a fan. It falls off all the time. I was just creating the conditions for new ways of seeing, new ways of thinking to come into being.
And then what about the notion of courage and meditation? Do you see any connection there, or any relationship between being courageous and and practicing meditation?
Well, interestingly, the practice of loving kindness meditation, which is its own method, is said to be a direct antidote to fear. And of course, other methods help as well. Mindfulness, for example, has helped me, I think, understand my own fear much more clearly. And what I've seen in terms of mindfulness is that despite the kind of conventional understanding and saying, which is also true, that we're afraid of the unknown, I've noticed for myself that in reality, I'm not all that afraid of the unknown, that I get mostly afraid when I think I do know and it's going to be really bad. That it's all the stories I tell myself, well, that's going to happen, that's not going to work out, and then you'll never, that's when fear really arises most strongly for me. And that when I remind myself, well, you don't know, I think, oh, right, I don't know. There's space. I feel some relief. So insight or wisdom just born from personal observation, which is mindfulness, can be very helpful. And then loving kindness practice is the direct antidote to just that kind of habitual response of fear. Because, like, I've had a lot of people who perform in front of crowds for one reason or another, public speaking or music or art or poetry or something. And many of them are quite nervous and have a lot of stage fright. And they tell me that if they stand there and do loving kindness practice, as they look out at that crowd, it's what I was describing before. Instead of feeling like they're all out there waiting to judge me, there's a feeling of, oh, it's a we rather than self and other. Okay, we're sitting here together. We're about to have an experience together.
Yeah.
It's very, very different kind of flavor.
Okay. And finally, before we finish, I just wanted to know if you've shared a lot of helpful insights and tips, but was there one tip that comes to mind that you'd like to share with the listeners who are sort of embarking on trying to bring a regular meditation into their life or exploring mindfulness in a more intensive way?
Well, I'm a giant advocate of daily practice, even if it's just a few minutes a day. I think there's something about cutting the momentum of our lives and just sitting down. It says something about, a lot of times people say, well, I can't do that, I'm so busy, or it's selfish. But really, it's so helpful. And it's also very, very hard to do. We usually talk about, say, 20 minutes a day, and it's quite genuinely hard for a lot of people to, say, sit or do mindful walking, whatever it might be, for 20 minutes. And I just find that doing it is hard and it's essential. And so whatever helps you do it, whether it's finding a group that you can sit with at least now and then, or almost ritualizing it, like, okay, I'm going to wake up in the morning and then I'm going to practice, and then I'm going to go to my computer or whatever it is. Finding the way that will help you make it real, because that's the hardest thing and it's the most important thing.
Great. Thank you so much. I absolutely feel very privileged to have your time, and I'm very thrilled to be able to share some of your thoughts and insights with the listeners, and I hope that people will go and explore your books and audio meditations. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.